the place where we have the most leverage is the workplace, not just because we spend most of our waking hours there, but it's also where so many critical decisions are made that frame the way the world works. I knew from my faith that I had to be faith active at work, but I knew from the workplace that it didn't want me to be. What was I supposed to do with that?
Welcome to the Lausanne Movement Podcast, where we have a passion to accelerate global mission together. If you like today's episode, won't you take a moment to rate and review our podcast and subscribe? That way you won't miss a thing. And now, for today's interview. Well, Chuck Proudfoot, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you, Jason. It's great to be here.
So one of the visions of Lausanne, we have a fourfold vision, and the last one is kingdom impact in every sphere of society. And one of those spheres of society is business. It's the workplace. Our CEO, Michael O, speaks about the 99% of Christians who spend their life in the workplace. And I'm really excited to meet with you. I'm excited to interview you because one of my heart passions for those within my own church and my community is for them to begin to see their local workplace as their place of ministry. And so I'm really excited about this conversation. Chuck, you are running an amazing ministry at Work on Purpose. And so to kick us off, could you introduce yourself to the audience? What led you to become a Christian? It seems like you have a story to tell, and so I want to give you space to share that story. And what captured your heart that led you to Christ? So I want to give you a moment to share that with the audience.
Sure. Thank you, Jason. I grew up in a happy but not a holy household in the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains in the state of Colorado in the United States. My parents were English professors, so I grew up as what's called a college brat. And I was surrounded by academics and a lot of learning, but the thing called religion sort of floated out there without any direct connection to my life. I knew it was there. I knew some people believed in a God, but I didn't have any frame of reference for that. However, when I got to Harvard University, where I was studying business, I was then living in the most cosmopolitan place I'd ever been. I had friends from all over the world. They represented all the faith traditions of the world. And as I got to know them, we'd hang out and they would tell me their stories. Now, I understand looking back on it that they were sharing their faith testimonies with me. But at the time, it was just me getting to know them. And I loved that. I was fascinated. All of them seemed to be more grounded. When things got difficult, they didn't seem to get as discouraged or destabilized. They'd all found God's truth. Their truths were contradictory, and truth doesn't contradict itself. All of that was this mystery that sort of floated around in the back of my head. But it was on the back burner because the front burner was my emerging career. So I graduated from Harvard and I ended up working for over a decade in corporate America. So I was in general management in a series of industry-leading multinationals. And the very short version of this story, Jason, is that my frustration with work ended up triggering a spiritual search. And as I walked through that and spent over a decade studying comparative world religions and philosophies, I eventually committed my life to Christ at age 31, a 30-something young working professional spending most of my waking hours at work.
So let's talk about the frustration that you experienced at work. I mean, what was it and why was that such a draw card towards finding God?
So if you can imagine my parents taking out a second mortgage on their house to send their son to Harvard with visions that I would become an academic just like them. And instead, I moved to what they viewed as the parochial Midwest to work in greedy corporate America. And to add insult to injury, I was employed by Procter & Gamble and assigned to toilet paper. About a year into my job, my whole life kind of turned upside down. I remember my mother calling me at one point and saying to me, "Chucky, you're flushing your career down the toilet." And of course, a young man doesn't want his mother to be speaking truth. And yet I started to wonder if she was right. I was working on a brand that in the US was doing only $59 million a year in sales, and it wasn't generating the profits that the company wanted. And after 6 months of research with our target consumers, these were female heads of household aged 25 to 54, what we learned was that the only way we were going to make this product more profitable was to take an indirect price increase. And we did this with what's called a sheet count reduction, Jason. So we took 30 sheets off of each roll. We wound the rolls more loosely so that the diameter was the same as before the sheet count reduction. And then we took a tiny increase in the thickness of the paper. And my job, which got me promoted, was to market this as new and improved. New because it had 30 fewer sheets, and improved because it was thicker. And I was less than inspired. I was in my early 20s, and I had what I would describe not a midlife crisis, a quarter life crisis. I remember walking home from work and thinking to myself, I'm going to get promoted for short sheeting the consumer. And I walked into my apartment, a bachelor pad on a hill that looked out over the city of Cincinnati, and I was feeling depressed. Walked out onto the deck and I sat down, and I was remembering back just months earlier at Harvard University, where my friends who'd found God seemed to have more stability in times of discouragement. And I didn't feel that at all. I wanted that. And that frustration with work, my misfit vocationally, triggered a spiritual search for me. And so over the course of 10 years, I studied all the original source material for the major world religions and philosophies. So I'm reading the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, the Dhammapada, the Torah, the New Testament. I'm diving into philosophy, the Analects of Confucius, the dialogues of Plato. And I come to Christ in November of 1996. After a decade of working in corporate America and trying to figure out where I fit. And what I came to understand was that until I could understand my identity in Christ, I couldn't do a very good job of understanding my purpose in life or my purpose for work.
Yeah, I mean, it really sounds to me that you share a similar journey to many young adults that I know of seeking to find meaning and purpose in their work, in their day to day. And I think God has really created us to live significant lives, lives that actually do make a difference in the world. And I think it's actually such a beautiful testimony to the friends that you had at Harvard, that you were able to reflect back on them and see their experience and say there's something about them that I need for myself. And so you came to faith in Christ, and you continue to work in the workplace. Tell me about that experience, that transition of being a non-believer in the workplace to becoming a believer in the workplace. How did that transition look? Was there something unique? I suppose there would be, because you ended up running a workplace network, but please share that with us.
It was jarring and it was disorienting. My sense of church, Jason, was largely formed by reading the New Testament. My favorite book of the Bible is the book of Acts. So if you could imagine that your frame of reference for the church is the early church, then imagine that you start going to church regularly and you discover that the vast majority of working Christians go to church on Sunday and work on Monday, separating faith and work, completely contrary to the early church. So I felt absolutely convicted that I needed to put faith at the center of my whole life. Since I'm spending most of my waking hours at work, I have to have a faith life in my work life. I don't see any role models or direction from local church. And what that meant to me was I have to figure it out. And I've got God helping me, but I sure did feel lonely. And in those earliest years, the minute I started expressing my faith in my work, I got pushback right away. Now, I don't know if this is true in all countries, but in the US, there's a rule that you just sort of learn as you're growing up and you start a career, which is that there are two things you don't talk about at work, which are religion and politics. Well, the minute I started expressing myself spiritually, I got pushback and I didn't know what to do with that. I knew from my faith that I had to be faith active at work, but I knew from the workplace that it didn't want me to be. What was I supposed to do with that? And I started experimenting. At this point, I had left corporate America. I'd started a consulting firm of my own, and I prayed into that. And God said, this will be a Christ-centered consultancy. And what you need to do is put Christ at the center of your heart, your head, and your hands. I began to do that, to be gentle as a dove and shrewd as a serpent, to figure out what it would look like to translate stained glass beliefs to plain glass application in a work world that's largely indifferent to faith expression, but sometimes very hostile. And in the last few years, I would argue much more hostile, at least in the US. That's how it started. It was trial and error. What I learned was that I had to become multilingual and multimodal. I needed to be able to translate my faith into practical terms that the workplace at large could understand and appreciate in order to earn the favor of the people around me at work and earn the credibility to speak spiritually into their lives.
Wow, that's really, really good. I really resonated with this concept of integrating Christ into your head, your heart, and your hands. And so, before we dive into how your passion to integrate all of that into your life became a movement and a network, could you just share for those who are listening, how do they take the stained glass and turn it into the plain glass when they are in the workplace? Do you have like any words of encouragement for the workplace people who are listening that you could say, hey, this is something I can give you that is to encourage you in this next step?
Absolutely. For me, it starts with the premise. Jesus said, "Seek first the kingdom, and all these other things will be added unto you." And in practical terms, I think of the kingdom as the world as it ought to be, rather than the world as it is. And closing that gap is what we're called to do individually and collectively. The place where we have the most leverage is the workplace, not just because we spend most of our waking hours there, but it's also where so many critical decisions are made that frame the way the world works. Then, after understanding that each and every one of us is strategically deployed by the Lord to all these different channels of cultural influence, all these different spheres of society, to bring the kingdom into the world, to bring heaven to earth, then we start to figure out vocabulary and methodology. What I have learned is that the world hungers for the kingdom, even those who are distant from the Lord, but the vocabulary is different. For example, take the word shalom, right? If I were to go to the work and say, man, I want to bring shalom to this place, everybody would look at me and say, you want to do what? And of course, my intent there is to bring complete well being. That's a simple definition of shalom. But if I go to the workplace and say, I want this place to flourish, everybody can understand that idea. Now they're curious for the details, but all I did was change the word. And in doing so, I earned the interest of the people around me. So for me, I have learned that vocabulary is where you start. I make myself a student of important words that we need to have as Christians, and then how we translate those words to a secularized work environment. The second thing for me, Jason, is not just vocabulary, but methodology. Like, how do we actually approach our work so that we are ambassadors of reconciliation, to reference that scriptural idea? And I have told people over the years and actually developed an entire equipping approach around this. We build our witness at work one choice at a time. If, as Christians, we can start becoming more choiceful when the everyday choices at work confront us, how do we compel the kingdom into that choice? And I could go a lot deeper in how to think about that, but I have learned that if you can focus on choices and make more godly choices, you will start to bring the kingdom into the place where you work, and it will begin to flourish. It will look more like it ought to. And at the end of the day, we start to win people spiritually because they're tasting the kingdom.
Well, I mean, what are some words that you have a part of your vocabulary that you encourage everyday Christians to include in their workplace? What are some of those words?
Well, for me, they revolve around some choiceful areas. So I'm going to build on that idea of choices for just a minute. Of course, you know that as Christians, we're commanded. It's not just a suggestion, it's a command to integrate our faith with our work. But once we do and we walk into the workplace, are we going to choose to respond to God's call for our work or resist it? And this is sort of the vocational call. Now, The root word there, vocare, a call of God for work, right? I'm not going to go into a secularized work environment and say, man, you need to figure out what God's calling you to do with your work. But what I can say is, I have a belief that every person is wired with special skills to contribute in a special way to the workplace. And I want to help you as a colleague or a direct report figure out your highest and best use. When I talk that way, people appreciate it. Everybody, well, not everybody, almost everybody really wants to succeed in their work, but often struggle. They're misplaced. They may be in a job that their parents told them they should take because it makes them more money, or that they were able to get a position to do, but it's really not their heartfelt passion and they feel stuck. It's liberating when you can start walking with people to explore the idea that there might be a place in the workplace that's just for them. So that's where I start. A second area is, are we going to commit to kingdom standards at work or compromise on those standards? Now, the way I speak about that in the workplace is, what does it look like for us to set a higher standard ethically or morally? There are so many examples, Jason. One that comes to mind for some reason right now is Dieselgate. Remember when VW rigged its software and the engineers did it deliberately so that it would look like their diesel engines were passing emission standards when they weren't. And eventually this was caught in the US around about 2015. But VW's paid out over $30 billion in fines for Dieselgate. And, I look at that as a Christian and I think to myself, where was the voice of a Christian at VW to say, let your yes be a yes and your no, no? Why was that biblical principle absent in the leadership of VW? And, you don't have to be a Christian to appreciate that if you bought a VW and it was a diesel, and then all this happens, and then your resale value plummets, that you bought into a brand that let you down. People get that. Then there's another area too, which is, are we going to just be spectators as we do our jobs? People around us at work are hurting or suffering, or are we going to step up and get involved? Are we going to serve them to make their lives better? Sometimes it might be somebody's just stuck on their computer and they need help figuring out how to run a computer program. Well, that is ministry in the marketplace. And you might have to take a little bit of time away from your job to help them with their job. But when you do that, you earn the favor of the people around you. In the early church, they were masters of this. They stepped up and served sacrificially. When the Romans would run for the hills when there was a plague, it was the Christian church that stepped in to serve people medically at the risk of their own lives. I mean, talk about a statement of service. And, I don't know about around the world, but in the US, our average congregation has under 100 members, Jason, but the average everyday working Christian has a sphere of influence of over 300 people, three times the size. If we start to think of the people around us at work as our mission field, it begins to change everything. We all have job descriptions, but we also have a role. Our real purpose at work is to use our platform at work to bring the kingdom to work. And last but not least, what does it look like for us to be stewards of the resources entrusted to us at work to make the hurting world around us a better place? We can be the voice through the workplace that says, let's not just spend all these resources on ourselves. How can we be a good corporate citizen? How can we give back to the communities where our employees live as well as work? Notice my plain glass language here. All of these areas of choice and all of these conversations can be expressed in terms that anybody can appreciate and buy into.
Yeah, Chuck, I think the thing that I'm resonating with as you're speaking is actually what you're talking about here is a contextualization of your Christian belief system in the workplace, right? It's like a missional approach. If you want to take the gospel into another culture, you have to contextualize. You have to adapt to the culture and bring the truth of the gospel into that space in language that that culture will understand and in a way that that culture will understand. And what you're saying is essentially, let's take like missional ideas, biblical ideas, and bring them into the reality of our workspace in a way that our workplace colleagues will be able to understand and connect with. And I think that's actually such a beautiful approach.
And Jason, When you see just one Christian in the workplace that works the way I just described, people gravitate to that person. They become magnetic, the salt and the light. They earn the favor of the people around them. But just dream with me for a minute. If every Christian in the work world worked the way I just described, think how transformational that would be for the world through our work.
It's certainly mind blowing. And I think that's the potential that we're referring to when we're speaking about the 99% who actually the ones called to ministry as full-time pastors and teachers and evangelists. Their role is to equip, right? Equip for ministry. I'm curious, Chuck, before we dive into your work at Work on Purpose and everything about that, I really do want to get there, but I don't want to leave this moment. I'm thinking about my many friends who are in the workplace, my family members who are in the workplace. Many of them don't have the vision that you have. And I'm curious, as you are interacting with people like that, how do you take that vision that you have and the fire that's in your heart, and how do you translate that for a normal Christian who does just see their Sunday as their religious act or the way that they connect with God, and they're disconnected their Monday through to Saturday from the active presence of God in that space or the kingdom impact in those spaces?
If you think about it, as Christians, when we show up at a local church for services on a weekend, we are surrounded by friends. We are often in small groups. We have all kinds of equipping programs, hopefully insightful sermons and inspiring worship music. And there's this whole sense of belonging. Then you have all of that on Sunday, and then Monday morning rolls around and you go to work and you feel spiritually isolated. You don't have any of that. And you didn't get any messaging typically on the weekends that your work was a place for faith. So even if you feel an inkling that your faith should inform your work, you don't have a clue how to even get started. And this is how hard it is for an everyday person to go from such a warm environment on the weekends to such a cold environment during the work weeks. This is why I love to say, Jason, that community trumps content every single time. So often as Christians, we go right to equipping. Man, we just need to teach people to be faith active in work. And I certainly agree that we need to do that. What I have found is that the most important place to start is actually to find other believers who can be part of a community with us in our work. And it's really interesting because there is a very significant biblical precedent for this. In Matthew 18:20, Jesus is quoted to say, "Where two or three are gathered in my name, there I am in their midst." What most people don't know is that the origin of that expression was actually a Roman military term, conventus civium Romanorum. What it meant was where two or three Roman citizens would enter a foreign land, the empire of Rome was already present. Often those two or three Romans were spies that were entering that land to scout it out for the Roman Empire before an invasion. In other words, Jesus was co-opting this Roman term and infusing it with kingdom DNA. He was saying where two or three Christians enter the foreign land of work, the kingdom of God, I am present in community with them right there where they are working. When we build a conventus in our place of work, just two or three working Christians gathered together, there Jesus is in their midst, empowering us with the spiritual authority to bring heaven to earth in the place where he has deployed us to work for the kingdom. So I always start with community. And it's fascinating when you start to do what I'll call a spiritual audit of the place where you work, and you start to get to know people. And really, it's about building relationships with all the people around you. But you can start to discern the people who are Christ followers. And then you bring those people together. And then everything grows from that. There are many organized expressions of this. For example, in corporations now, what are called ERGs or employee resource groups. And that's a great organized way to bring working Christians together in large firms. But most of us work in smaller organizations. And what we need to do is our own little spiritual audit and form our own little conventus.
So let's talk about At Work on Purpose. The way that you and I were able to get connected together was through Mark Green from LICC, the London Institute of Contemporary Christianity. And we had him on the podcast, and it was so great connecting with him. But after the podcast, he dropped me an email and he said, "You have to connect with Chuck Proudfoot. I've just seen what he's doing in Cincinnati, and it blew me away." And so could you share a little bit about At Work on Purpose? Just explain to our podcast audience what it is and share with us what was the vision that led to the birthing of this ministry, essentially.
First of all, Mark is such a dear friend and colleague, and he and I both share the belief that the church at work, organized across cities, is one of the next most strategic expressions of reaching the culture for Christ. Now, with that as a backdrop, At Work on Purpose, to be honest, Jason, was an accidental ministry.
They're always the best.
Yes, well, God kind of ambushed me, to be perfectly honest, and he was up to some holy mischief, and I fortunately was obedient to the direction unfolded. I had, as I mentioned earlier, come to Christ in November of 1996. So 1997 is my first year as a Christ follower. I'm experimenting with what faith looks like at work, and I'm starting to learn through trial and error how to make that work. Then, round about 2003, so 6 years later, I start thinking to myself, I would love to have a life group for work life. I've started becoming faith active in my work, but I'm really lonely. I miss having a community. I didn't at the time, Jason, have a vision for a whole ministry. I just thought, wouldn't it be fun? Like local churches have small groups. How about a small group for working Christians? I could not find a local church that would support me to launch one. It was so frustrating. However, I am an entrepreneurial guy. So I thought to myself, well, I'll just find a dozen people myself. And I did. I found about a dozen people from around the greater Cincinnati, Ohio area who had a heart for the Lord in the workplace. And we were men and women from different parts of the city. We attended different church homes during the weekends. We belonged to different denominations, but we all had the common cause of Christ at work. We met a couple times a month on Thursday evenings from 7 to 8:30 in a midpoint location of the city that was fairly convenient for everyone. And I convened it. I facilitated the meetings, but there was no organized curriculum. There were no materials. There are many more materials now than there were then, but this was completely free flowing. What I did not anticipate was how powerfully the Holy Spirit would move in these conversations. They were electric, Jason. And entirely through word of mouth, with no intent to grow, we went from a dozen people to over 300 people within 6 months. It blew me away. And as this larger group of people started getting to know each other, they came to me and said, well, we want more than just small groups. Chuck, this is becoming a ministry. and, and I'm looking at all of them completely befuddled, Jason, because if you can imagine for just a moment, if you're me, so you have a degree in organizational development from Harvard University, you've worked for 3 industry-leading multinational corporations as a general manager. You're completely raised up and trained in building organizations, but what you see in front of you looks more like an organism than an organization. It's like massive people. And I looked at that, I'm like, how am I supposed to lead that? I was just completely confused. And I'm praying into that. And what I heard God say was, sit down, Sparky. I'm leading it. You're not. That was the first thing. And the second thing was, Chuck, you're reading a book right now called Experiencing God by the Blackabees. Why don't you just do what they're already telling you? And for those who haven't read the book, the gist of it is that you don't need to have a mountaintop experience to understand how God is calling you to serve. Sometimes you just need to see where God is already moving and join him there. That was the trigger for me. I started joining working Christians and workplace ministries in Cincinnati right where they were working. I built relationships with the leaders and the individuals, and I earned their favor. I just was a good friend to them. I encouraged them. I brought visibility to them in larger gatherings where I could interview them and have their stories told. Started to create a simple newsletter where we could highlight their stuff and connect them to other people. And before I knew it, this network started to grow. And it had the same DNA, Jason, as that very first small group. Church homes, denominations, zip codes from across the city, an eclectic set of working Christians who weren't brought together because of a uniformity of theology, but rather a unity to be the Big C church at work across a city. And that's how At Work on Purpose was born.
And tell me, what does At Work on Purpose look like today? I mean, is it a large group gathering once a month, or do you try to keep the small group model going out throughout the city? Could you share a bit about the structure of it?
First of all, it looks today very much like it did back then, much more of an organism than an organization. So when I say a network, it very much resembles a network in the way we think about it in the marketplace. It's not what you know, it's who you know. I'm sure, Jason, that you have social media and you have people who follow you, right? They opt in to be part of your programming. That's what it's like with At Work on Purpose. Working Christians in our city opt in to be part of the network for At Work on Purpose. Today, over 12,000 of them have opted in. They participate where they have interest. And that is fascinating to watch. So, unlike an organization where you sort of have a whole bunch of programming that you manage, this is more about creating a networked platform so that people can connect in and participate in the things of interest to them. Having said that, we have found over the years that there are several different buckets or categories of participation that tend to draw people, and we've given them some official sounding names. The first one is purposeful employment. People who are drawn to the idea that God did create them for a purpose at work, that He's prepared good works in advance for them to do, and they want to know what those are. Sometimes it's all about reframing their current work so that they don't just see it as a position, but as a platform, and they start to learn how to bring ministry into the job they have. But other times, they're in the wrong line of work and they need guidance to figure out where they should be working and how they should be serving. This is what purposeful employment's about. The second bucket we call vocational discipleship. This is people who are becoming much more conscious of the opportunity to be on mission in everyday work. They recognize all of these spiritual opportunities that are in front of them all day, every day. However, most of them are very ill-equipped to be faith active at work. They haven't heard about the idea of workplace ministry in their local churches most of the time. They don't have role models typically, and they are hungry for guidance. We equip them with a range of different materials, and we have some ourselves as a ministry, but many times it's about leading people to the very good ministry initiatives of others. What matters to us is that people learn how to be faith active at work, from the wow to the how of faith at work. So that's vocational discipleship. And then workplace engagement is a third bucket. That one's really fun. This is when working Christians start to recognize that not only can they pursue their highest and best use at work to be faith active through their vocational work, but that we together can be the ecclesia, the church on mission together in the city to seek the peace and prosperity of the city where we work and live together. And what that looks like is projects, prototypes that enable us to bring faith to work on a larger scale for the flourishing of the city.
So you've mentioned purposeful employment, vocational discipleship, workplace engagement. Are those the three buckets?
Those are the three primary buckets.
And do you see them as almost like steps, or are there three different things that three different buckets that need to be filled up?
Oh, that's such a good question. And the answer is yes. Is light a particle or a wave? Yes. Here's where I'm coming from. For many working Christians, it's a novel idea to think that faith should be integrated with work. In our country, the Barna organization did a workplace study in 2018 and found that only 28% one of every 4 working Christians even aspires to bring faith to work. I have found as a practitioner that only 5%, 1 out of 20 working Christians consistently bring Sunday faith to Monday work. So our starting point is kind of like a massive illiteracy rate. It's really horrendous. So for many, it's mastering the fundamentals. They need to start at ground zero. What does it look like for me to understand God's design for me in and through work? They start at the beginning with purposeful employment. And then once they figure out where they're positioned, then they move into vocational discipleship. How do I get much more strategic and effective at faith expression through work? And then as they get better in their individual journey, they start thinking to themselves, well, how can I connect with other working Christians and we can engage the workplace at larger scale for more impact? So there's definitely a sequence there, and many working Christians walk through that. However, it's been my experience as a practitioner, Jason, that all of us, in a sense, go through this as a cycle. For example, if a working Christian has a midlife crisis in your 40s or something, and you're trying to figure out what it looks like for you to finish well. In the US, sometimes this is called halftime, to move from success to significance. And all of a sudden, now in the middle of my career, I want to redevelop and redefine my work. So you may have done some of that earlier, but now you're doing it again. I have tended to see it as both an initial sequence for many who are starting at ground zero, but also as an ongoing cycle for all of us.
So Chuck, I'm listening to you. At this stage, if people are still with us on the podcast, they're really with you, right? And perhaps they're thinking about their own city. They're not in Cincinnati. There isn't a beautiful network of Christians doing anything like this. For the listeners who are inspired by this conversation and want to contribute they want to start a similar type of ministry or network within their own city or community, what advice would you give them? What steps can they begin to take in order to build that network and create a platform where people could build these buckets?
First of all, I'll give a few just general suggestions, and then I'll close out with a more universal one. The place to start is relationships. I didn't realize at the time because I was just being faithful to what I heard God telling me. But when we start to invest time building relationships with other working Christians, we start to build a network of Christians at work. There's no mystery in that. But the irony is, most of us as working Christians don't even do that. We build networks of Christians in our church homes and maybe, in some parachurch ministries where we volunteer or something like that. But we have to start at ground zero with relationships with other working Christians. Then the second thing is what it looks like to turn those relationships into some sort of a more cohesive or organized network effort. I like to describe it as a decentralized organic network of spiritual influence that canvasses a city. A simple way that we started to do this, and anyone could, is as you get to know individuals and also workplace ministries in the city, start to create some kind of a forum where people can get to know each other, connect with each other, build opportunities with each other. Those are simple things, like you maybe every few months have some sort of a weeknight gathering to just build relationships and maybe share some things on a stage and have some exhibits where people are showing what they do. Maybe it's a newsletter that goes out every month that has information so people can connect into things, or social media or whatever. So that's the second piece. The third piece, once you have a critical mass of people involved, what I've typically observed is that there is a set of Christian workplace leaders who kind of bubble to the top. They're like a core team, and they are driven for more. They're often Christian business leaders, type A's, who are like, hey, we want to do something bigger here. Let's really have an impact. What would it look like if? And they start to dream and scheme to have some holy mischief for initiatives that could be set up and launched in and for the city at large, that would require the collective effort of a number of Christians and workplace ministries that have now been connected together through relationship. So those would be 3 general suggestions that I would make. Now, what we are doing, and what might be of interest to some of the people listening to this, we are building out a global network for what we call citywide workplace movement. It's our belief that God is calling us as a new wineskin to build a 21st century expression of the first century church at work. It's fascinating when you look at the first century church. They were organized in cities like Ephesus and so forth. And if we begin to think the same way, how are we not just working Christians in a city, but for a city? That we start to pursue the peace and prosperity of those cities, we start to build relationships with each other across those cities, sharing best practices, encouraging each other. Just like you can have a network within a city, we can have networks across a city. For anyone who's interested in that, if they just reach out to us at atworkonpurpose.org, that's our website. That's a simple way to get started.
Wonderful. I'll be sure to put that in the show notes for those who are interested. And I really want to encourage you to go and take a look. You also have resources on the side as well that they can connect with. You said something that was interesting that I want to touch on. You said the purpose is not just to be in a city, but for a city. And I think that's quite a significant statement, that seeking of the prosperity of the city and the flourishing of the city. In what ways? And I'm looking for a story here of ways that you have seen the flourishing of the city being birthed out of a network like your own. What have you seen in your own experience that has birthed change because Christians have united together for purpose?
Well, I wish we had a day because I could talk you through so many prototypes, but I'll just pick one off the top of my head. I had a chance to visit with a pastor who had recently purchased a property. It was an abandoned tool and die manufacturing plant that had been first built right after World War II. So the price was affordable for this little startup church. But he wanted a way to use the space, not just during the weekends, but through the work week. And he had reached out to me as somebody in the congregation who came from the marketplace. And he and I developed a vision for a local church whose facilities would be purposed to house faith-based entrepreneurial ventures through the work week that would minister through products and services and generate profit dollars that would help to fund the operations of the church, with the big, holy, audacious goal that a day could come when 100% of the operating costs of the church could be covered by the profits of those enterprises, so that 100% of tithes and offerings could go out to the community for ministry. And we built out that prototype. And not only did we do that, but we inspired other local churches across the greater Cincinnati area. There are about a half dozen of them now who have repurposed their local church facilities. And this movement is now starting to spread across the United States. And there's a book by Amy Sherman called Agents of Flourishing. Chapter 12 of that book is devoted to this prototype.
Fantastic. As a local church pastor and someone who loves the local church, I'm buying into that vision. I mean, every pastor struggles with trying to encourage the tithe and the offerings. And what if it could look something so different so that the tithes and the offerings could actually just be used for ministry within the city? And I think that really sounds compelling to me. So let's talk about church pastors for a moment, because I really think that this is a conversation that needs to be had with church pastors. What advice would you give to pastors or church leaders who wonder how to better engage and equip workplace leaders within their congregations? They're looking out every Sunday. They're seeing every single one of them going out into their spheres of influence. What words of encouragement or advice would you give them?
I have several suggestions. As a preamble, let me say that my heart goes out to local church pastors who are so pressed in a post-COVID world to figure out what it looks like just to keep the doors open, keep congregants coming, be relevant to the community, float the boat financially, deal with all the pressures of a society that seems to be drifting away from the institutionalized models of local church. So I appreciate the challenges, and I serve as an elder in a local church. So these suggestions are not from somebody who doesn't get the pressures, but it's my belief that we all need to start thinking new wineskin. The institutional expressions of local church in so many ways constrain us from the opportunities that are in front of us. Instead of come and see, what does it look like to go and be? And let me be specific. When local church pastors can go with their congregants to the places where they work and see firsthand what it's really like to be a Christian in the workplace, the struggles that we really deal with, the hard choices we really do make, and the heartfelt depth of the prayer requests that we do bring to the local church from the workplace, because there's no substitute for experience as the best teacher. Then, with that deeper kind of understanding about what it's really like to be faith expressive at work, my second suggestion would be for a pastor to begin to bring people on stage who are faith active working Christians who can really speak to the hows. How are they bringing faith to their work? Celebrate them as missionaries to the marketplace, for example, not just the people that you're sending off to Africa or something for global missions. Of course, you probably find that amusing, Jason, since you live on the continent of Africa. Here I am in the US. But in the US, we often say that, hey, your mission field doesn't just have to be in Africa, it could be in the place where you work, right? So that would be my second suggestion, because then the subject matter experts, not the pastors, the subject matter experts are actually the ones that are on stage. The third suggestion that I have is to partner with those subject matter experts to start building some type of ministry programming that is sustained through the church for the workplace. And it's really important that it is birthed through the subject matter experts who are Christians in the workplace that attend in the church versus just a staff person on the church. Because for sustainability purposes and for relevance purposes, they're going to be better situated to lead it than pastoral staff.
So good. I think those are really valuable insights. So thank you. Thank you for sharing that. We're going to have to begin to bring this podcast recording to a close. Before we do, I would love to hear, looking ahead, what are your dreams for the growth of At Work? You've already mentioned a few dreams that you have. And how do you see it expanding and deepening its impact in cities and even globally?
I am increasingly convinced that we are in the midst of another upheaval and reinvention of the church. Anybody who studies church history knows that every 500 years in the history of the church, we've had a major upheaval. In 8500, it was the collapse of the Roman Empire and the need of the church to learn new ways to spread the gospel. In 81,000, it was the corruption of the Vatican. The papacy became a piggy bank for some Italian nobles. In AD 1500, it was the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther splitting and creating Protestantism as opposed to Catholicism as a universal church. And the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation was in 2018. So it's my belief that all of us are living in a very exciting but challenging season of church history where God is calling us in our different areas to think new wineskin, not just refining existing models, but birthing new ones. And it is my belief that the church at work in cities is one of those new wineskins. I am convinced from what I've seen working in dozens of cities now all across the world that our job in my terms is to propagate a meme. What does it look like to build the Big C church at work in and through cities? That is a strategic beachhead for fulfilling the Great Commission across the world. And it revolves in a very interesting way around what Michael O said at the Global Workplace Forum in 2019. He got on stage and he said, first of all, we should focus on the 99% of working Christians who aren't employed in local churches and parachurches. Second, we should focus on cities because of the population that's migrating from rural to urban areas. And third, we need to shift from the wow to the how. So we develop practical ways to be the church at work in and for cities to complete the Great Commission. This is what the citywide workplace movement is.
Wow. So you have a lot of people paying attention to you right now. They've caught that vision. How can they connect with you online? You've already mentioned your website. Are there any other ways that they connect with you or any resources that you'd like to point them to?
Yes, they can reach me directly. My email is chuck@workonpurpose.org. And I want all of those listeners to know that within a year, we expect to have a completely different and larger platform for this citywide workplace movement, which isn't about any one ministry, At Work on Purpose or others. It's about building a platform to connect the church at work in cities across the world.
Awesome. I'll be sure to put that in the show notes as well. Chuck, this has been such a rich time. Any final thoughts you'd like to leave with our listeners before we close off?
Gratitude. to you, Jason, for the opportunity to share a little bit about this story, and to the Lausanne movement for recognizing the significance of the 99% and to embrace workplace as an important place to focus for the Great Commission.
Oh, thank you for that, Chuck. We're certainly trying, and I'm hoping that we can improve our efforts and our vision in that. So thank you for that. And thank you for your time. Thank you for the insights that you have brought, the value that you have brought to those who are listening. Chuck, this has been so wonderful. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.